All right, so in Module 7, we're going to be talking about experimental designs in SSD, and also discussing a little bit further what COPS questions mean and how we can use best practices and the research out there to really support evidence-based practices with our clients. So back to this diagram here about practice evaluation and the bigger picture. We've already covered goals, measurement, and evaluation design for most single system designs. What we have left to discuss is experimental designs. So I'm just going to review quickly what baselining is and different techniques that we can do to really evidence causality. Because so far with A-B design, all we can really do is show correlation with the intervention to particular outcomes. But there's different types of more advanced experimental designs where we can actually kind of suggest or have the evidence that we need to imply causality associated with our intervention. So again, baseline is a systematic collection of information on the client's problem during a non-intervention phase. So before we conduct any type of intervention, what was the problem and kind of what were we seeing before we stepped in with any sort of more formal intervention. A baseline represents what would be reasonably expected to continue to happen with the client's problem without the intervention. So no clinical interventions at all. What was the baseline before they even stepped into the office or before we went out to visit with the client? And what you're almost certainly going to be doing with your client for your single system design is A-B design, which is just a baseline and an intervention phase. The A-B design allows a practitioner to both monitor and evaluate. Again, A being the baseline phase and the intervention phase. So we can see if our intervention is associated with a positive change in our client's problem. But it doesn't really let us show causality. There are certainly implications for causality, but we don't have like the real statistical evidence to support the intervention caused the change, because it could be a number of other factors as well. So that's a limitation of an A-B design. It doesn't give us causal evidence. It only shows us that our intervention was associated with a change. So I'm going to show a real quick video to demonstrate the difference between correlation and causation.
Freakonomics. Well, hi there, boys and girls. This is Captain Kangaroo. Say, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. So, you know, it's lots and lots of fun to have a pet that you can run and play and jump with, isn't it? But did you know that there are some boys and girls who can't run and jump and play? It's all because of a thing called polio.
When I think of bad historical assumptions about correlation and causality, I think of polio 100 years ago, when it was this horrible mystery that it was, claiming a lot of lives, and it was really scary because it mostly struck children. And there was a strong line of research that suggested that ice cream caused polio, that ice cream consumption caused polio.
Here comes Mr. Softy, the soft ice cream man. The creamy and soft ice cream you get from Mr. Softy.
The reason that correlation was thought to be causal was that polio spiked in the summertime for reasons that really weren't very well understood, but it did. And ice cream sales spiked during the summertime. So these researchers had seen that whenever there was a lot of ice cream being sold and consumed, there was a lot more polio. And so there was really literally the beginnings of this kind of ice cream persecution to try to stomp out polio. And it sounds ridiculous, but you see it all the time now, people trying to fight against or build up something that they're sure is connected to something else, in which it turns out just isn't.
So in order to get at causality, we can do experimental single subject designs that are a planned way of understanding whether or not an intervention actually caused the client's problem to change, and not just whether it's associated with the change, which is a little bit different. So there's a few different examples of ways that you can do this. One of the most common ways is an A-B design, which is a baseline, intervention. And sometimes it can occur naturally. Maybe somebody drops out of therapy for a while and comes back. The issue is the second baseline oftentimes is retrospective, kind of based on what they believe to have happened during that period of non-intervention. Some of the strengths of A-B design is that it provides evidence as to whether or not the intervention actually caused the problem to change. So we can see if there are significant changes during the two intervention phases that weren't there during the baseline phases. But then the downside is that it can be kind of cumbersome, and removal of a successful intervention doing it purposefully is kind of unethical. So if you're giving somebody an intervention, they're doing well, then what's the point of stopping it, really? So I would say that it's generally only done in situations where maybe the second baseline is because somebody dropped out or stopped coming to treatment, or maybe the second baseline is really only caused because the clinician is, unavailable for whatever reason. Maybe they're on sick leave or something along those lines. So with the AB performance, we could make a better argument for causality because we can see that the treatment phase is clearly associated with improvements in student performance, just from the example in this graph. But that's not always necessarily going to be the case. Maybe sometimes you would see no real improvement associated with the intervention, or baseline really isn't that much different than the intervention. Then that way you could say that there really wasn't too much causality associated with the intervention, and you might want to try something completely different. So if starting a single system design, it's important to introduce the client to practice evaluation so that the client can clearly understand the facts to be obtained, and introducing the idea of measurement as a whole. The practitioner will also share their understanding of the facts with the client, and fact gathering kind of helps the practitioner to build a plan of action, and you can also modify it if need be. And maybe just a question for you to think about is, in single system design, is the independent variable the intervention or the client's goal? And which is the dependent variable? Hopefully you can kind of put it together that the dependent variable is the goal, what you're trying to change, and the independent variable, the variable that's coming in that you're hoping to manipulate, is the actual intervention. So I'm hoping after this you can check out my video on COPES questions and different types of resources out there for identifying evidence-based practices to address the specific client problem that you're hoping to address with your single system design. And I'll go through these different websites in a little bit more depth within the COPES video. So what do I mean by COPES? Again, a client-oriented practical evidence search. So converting information needs related to practice decisions into answerable questions, tracking down with maximum efficiency the best evidence to support those questions, and critically appraising the evidence for its validity and sample and impact and clinical effectiveness. And ultimately applying these results to practice decisions and evaluating the effectiveness of carrying out the steps 1 through 4. Also explaining in enough detail so that it could be replicated. Again, this will be covered in more depth in the COPES video. But I think the important thing to point out with the COPES question is that you've probably already used search engines to search for other information, and it's something that you're probably pretty familiar with already. What's going to be new to you is searching academic databases for research articles to support your evidence-based practices. And there's effective ways to do this that are specifically tailored to clinical practice that I'll discuss more in depth. So just some terms to point out here. For Boolean search strategies, using the word "and," you could search for child and adolescent. You could also use the Boolean "or," with "and" being an intersection of terms and "or" being a union of terms. But before starting your search, it's a good idea to come up with some key terms that you're going to want to search for. And it's a good idea to search free full-text search engines such as Google Scholar, Social Work Abstract, PsycInfo, Medline, PubMed. These will help you figure out what works and what research is out there. And oftentimes when you're searching for articles, you'll find that they've already done a little bit of a literature review themselves, and they'll kind of give you some context for where we're at in the field right now as far as that specific topic goes. And I'll just say, kind of like as a final discussion point, typically when you're starting off searching for these terms within these scholarly websites is when you're going to know the least about that topic. And through doing a little bit of a literature review, you're going to learn more and more about the topic, and that might lead you to omit some words or maybe add some words to your search term. I would also caution you against just skimming through abstracts, because lots of times just skimming through the abstract, a lot of people are guilty of doing this, but we might not really understand the limitations of the study and how they might apply to the clients that we're serving.